So, when I started this series, I intended to keep everything in season 4 out of it. I wanted it to be this neat little time capsule of things that I noticed while waiting for season 4. I had written out my list, not just of essay subjects, but of the planned things I wanted to talk about in those essays, especially for my character essays. I was planning to enjoy the show on Friday nights, then get up on Saturday mornings and write the next week's essay. But as I sat down to write this essay, the first one written after season 4's return, I knew that was impossible. There are things that I saw, things that I've been building towards in this essay series that I see taking place right before my eyes. So here are my rules going forward. As much as possible, I'm going to keep my essay topics the same. That shouldn't be hard because many of the character mechanics that I've been noticing are playing out openly before our eyes in season 4. Characters on Fire Country have grown, sure, but I think it's really neat to see how the mechanics are playing out in this new ultimate test. That's why it feels even more important to talk about where we started. So I'm not going to be reshaping my essays or the order that they come out in, with the exception of the Sharon and Luke essay. Somehow, while everybody was falling back in love with Bodiella during the season 4 premiere, I was going, wow, Sharon and Luke are so amazing in this episode. Aha, this is how they work. I want to make sure that when I get that essay out, it is as up to date as possible, which means I can't officially finish the draft until after the first half of season 4 stops premiering, which I'm guessing is going to be somewhere in mid-December. Hopefully I will have the essay mostly written by that point and I can just plug in a couple of paragraphs, but if something changes, I may end up putting Eve's essay out on New Year's Day and then wait and put my Luke and Sharon essay out for another 10 days on the day where I had been planning to release my Eve essay. I was already planning to make this Vince essay be about how I think he's a representation of PTSD, but now it feels even more important. We have Brett Richards with his degree in psychology coming in to diagnose the problems with Station 42 that led to Vince's death. On the surface, this is blatant victim blaming. Brett literally says to Bodhi in front of Sharon that Vince's leadership led to his death, but we the viewers know that isn't true. What led to Vince's death was Walter murdering him via kidnapping the only person who could have saved him. And ultimately, the reason Vince was put in that situation where Walter could play God and decide that he and Sharon would live while Vince died was that it was the abuser finally deciding to kill his victim. But like I talked about in Bodhi's essay, Vince also falls into that broad category of abusive father. A big part of Vince's arc in season 3 is that he's contemplating his similarities to Walter. And while sure, it's easy to say Vince was willing to die to rescue Bodhi, but Walter wasn't willing to die to save Vince, Vince couldn't have possibly known that. He died before that happened. To me, their differences really lie in the abuse and the factors that drove that abuse. I'm going to say this right now. Abuse is abuse. What matters to the survivor isn't the intent or the why behind it, it's the very real harm done. Nothing in this essay minimizes or contradicts what I said in Bodhi's essay. What Bodhi experienced was abusive, regardless of if Vince's behaviors were because of him having untreated PTSD. Mental illness can explain behavior, but if you have a mental illness and you're causing harm to others, it is your responsibility to get treatment, something Vince doesn't ever do. Likewise, generational trauma is very real, but that doesn't make generational trauma okay to pass down, and not everybody that participates in the cycle of generational trauma is doing it because they have PTSD. In any other context, and indeed in the rest of this series, I'm not going to be speculating on why someone is abusive because I think it can minimize the harm done. But in this specific context, Vince's arc in season 3 is about him wondering how much he is like Walter, and then he decides he is. Vince suffered so much at the hands of his father, but just months, actually maybe even just weeks before he dies, Vince decides that he has turned into Walter Leone towards his own kid. I'm not writing this essay to exonerate Vince's behaviors just because he has PTSD. Even though I haven't done it so far in the other character essays that I've written thus far in the series, when I was drafting Vince's essay, I went into this 35,000 word note document that I have on my computer where I have all the thoughts that I had as I was deconstructing Fire Country. And as I read Vince's section, which was about 2,000 words, the idea that I kept circling over and over again was that Vince had some type of mental health issue. I decided to take a look at the diagnostic criteria for PTSD because in Bad Guy we see Vince have flashbacks, and flashbacks are kind of the cultural shorthand for PTSD, and much to my surprise, his behavior fits so well that it can't have been an accident. I am very aware that it is trendy to retrofit TV show characters with mental illnesses to justify their actions, and somehow PTSD and trauma are like the number one things that people use to justify characters' behaviors. Severus Snape is a massive example of this because apparently being bullied makes someone a racist terrorist, but I digress. Alternatively, it is scarily common to strip characters of implied mental illnesses or developmental disorders when that depiction isn't perfect. Will Graham is canonically closer to autistic than sociopath, but nonetheless, the fanables refute this because the depiction isn't perfect. Likewise, it seems the autism versus sociopathy debate takes place every single week on the HouseMD subreddit. This despite the fact that The Good Doctor is such a copy of that show that it feels like David Shore's apology for his poor portrayal of what used to be called Asperger's. When it comes to explicit depictions of mental illness, I have a real love-hate relationship. On the one hand, I love The Good Doctor, not just because Michael Trucco is Sean's dad, but because it depicts level 2 autism and a world in which coworkers learn to adapt and create an environment where Sean's talents can serve patients but his limitations are worked around. On the other hand, I hate Monk, which started out as a case study in grief, but morphed into a show where mental illness was mocked and accommodation was treated like appeasement instead of equity. When Andy Breckman tried to right the ship in Mr. Monk's Last Case, fans panned the movie. Vince's PTSD sits somewhere in and in between. Vince never goes to a therapist, but Eve explicitly questions him about this in an episode. His behaviors can be read as just being a lovable ass, but we see depictions of his trauma on screen. His supposed mental illness is present enough that it doesn't feel like it was written accidentally, but it's pushed to the background enough that you're not going to find YouTubers like Dr. Elliot breaking down whether or not it's an accurate depiction of mental illness. Before we get into this, standard disclaimer that I will say anytime I am dissecting a complex topic that people spend years studying before they have to take a test to actually do as a job. I am not a doctor, I am not a nurse. I do work in healthcare, but my job is in policy. My work has a lot to do with medical billing, and if I have an actual medical question about what I write about, I have a nurse that I consult. If Dr. Elliot ever makes a video on this, I will link it below. This is not a definitive definition of what PTSD is. This is how I, as a writer, would read the diagnostic criteria if I wanted to write a character with PTSD. In this video, I'm going to be taking the diagnostic criteria for PTSD from the DSM-5, which is published by the American Psychological Association. This is considered the standard diagnostic manual for mental illnesses in the United States. I'm not going to talk about complex PTSD in this video because it isn't in the DSM. The ICD-11, which is published by the World Health Organization, is where we get the criteria for complex PTSD. From what I can tell, the APA considers CPTSD to just be a specific clinical presentation of PTSD. And when I talked to the nurse coworker that is in charge of policies for mental health, she said that that's also her understanding of it. Aside from my general rules about working with complex topics, I wanted to lay down a handful of rules about how I will examine the series as I show you examples of Vince having PTSD. Since this is a part of my Series 1 essay series, I've only included examples from Season 1. I was going to let myself meander into Seasons 2 and 3 to make my point, but looking through the diagnostic criteria, I realized that I didn't need to do this. There are a few scenes where Vince is more honest about his feelings throughout the series when he is one-on-one with someone, but again, I ended up not needing them. As a general rule across the whole series, I try not to dissect the same scene over and over again, unless it's something like the flashbacks to the night Riley died, because those are really foundational and have a lot of So instead, what I'm going to be doing is trying to spread my examples out over the first 16 episodes of season 1 and really focus in on those first 7 in particular. A couple more quick rules. I'm going to try as much as possible to grab things that are more specifically related to Vince's trauma from his childhood abuse. As needed, I will grab things specifically related to Riley's death because we don't see every symptom in regards to Walter's abuse. My last rule is that I'm going to work really hard to not just grab a ton of examples from Bad Guy. While that episode really is the core episode for Vince's PTSD, I don't want it to seem like we get one episode and that's where all of this evidence is coming from. Instead, wherever possible, I'm going to try to include things from those first 16 episodes and from Bad Guy separately. Now that we've moved past my methodology section of how I'm going to do the analysis, it's time to talk about what PTSD is. I think in our collective cultural consciousness, PTSD is misunderstood. There is this idea that if you have a traumatic event happen to you and you have nightmares about it afterwards, that this means you have PTSD. But PTSD is not just these 2 criteria. There are 8 criterion, and you have to have all of them. That's not to say that all cases of PTSD are identical. 6 of those 8 criterion have sub-criteria that creates endless numbers of combinations of what PTSD could look like. So I guess what I really find interesting about Vince is that he hits all 8 of the criterion. But let's walk through what those 8 criterion actually are, and then I'll go through each criterion as it applies to Vince. Then I think you'll be able to see that the writers clearly intended for him to be a representation of PTSD. I'm not going to break down every possible feature of criterion D and criterion E though. I'm specifically going to be breaking down the ones that specifically apply to Vince. While there are 8 criterion, I think you could really put them into 3 categories. The first is what I call the core symptoms, the traumatic event, reliving the traumatic event, and trying to avoid reminders of the traumatic event. The second 2 sets of criterion are what I call the affective symptoms. These are the things that really distinguish a reaction to trauma from PTSD. The third set is what I call the this is illness set, which focuses on how long and how severe the symptoms are, as well as excluding anything else that could be causing the symptoms. Now that we have understood these criterion, I'm going to go ahead and show how they apply to Vince. Talking about what counts as a traumatic event, the DSM-4 allowed basically any potentially traumatic event to count for the purposes of PTSD, but the DSM-5, released in 2014, narrowed it down to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. This event had to be personally experienced, directly witnessed, or you had to have learned that the event occurred to a close friend or family member. As a fourth thing, also, if you're repeatedly exposed to the traumatic thing, such as through work, that can also count. With Vince, there is no question he meets this. We see it in the episode Bad Guy that he wasn't just told about Riley's tragic accidental death, he personally witnessed the scene of the accident even if he didn't witness the accident himself. In addition, we know that he was a victim of severe physical child abuse and ongoing control type abuse. If you want to see that, please go ahead and check out my Walter essay. I've included it in the links below. The second criterion, called criterion B, is about intrusions and forced reminders of the event. That's where you would find nightmares, flashbacks, and also repeated unwanted memories. For children, you can also get them playing games where aspects or themes of the trauma show up in their games. We directly see Vince have flashbacks in Bad Guy to the night Riley died and Bodhi was kicked out. These aren't random scenes either. They are triggered by words or scenes that Vince experiences during that episode's rescue, which is about rescuing a brother and sister from a car accident wherein they both might die. As for intrusions related to Walter's abuse, I would say the only one we see comes from Vince's reaction to Walter's yelling at him in the season 3 episode Welcome to the Cult. You see it in Vince's body language. He gets tearful and is shaking when he recounts Walter's words he would say to Vince and Luke as he threatened to hurt them. We don't know exactly what's going on in Vince's head, but we know enough to make a guess at it and know that he meets this criteria. The final criterion of the core symptoms is criterion C. That's the one that focuses on avoidance. And this is going to seem controversial, but I think that Vince sending Bodhi away after Riley dies is actually a perfect example of this. He is literally sending away the person who was driving the car that his daughter died in. Vince later says that he told Bodhi, "I didn't want to see him anymore." This feels more like avoidance than dad punishing son for killing daughter. Likewise, as soon as Bodhi shows up in Edgewater, Vince is trying to have him sent away for going rogue. In that episode, he also accuses Bodhi of being a renegade, which is not a synonym of rogue. Instead, it means someone who abandons an ideological cause. Likewise, Vince is avoidant of Walter too, or at least he is at the start of the show. We don't hear about Walter until the season 1 episode Mama Bear, which is the 11th. We don't meet him for 9 more episodes, and he disappears completely from the narrative until Welcome to the Cult. He becomes a mainstay of the narrative 6 episodes later in Coming in Hot, and he has stuck around ever since, with the only Walter-free episode as of time of writing being Not Astray. So Vince seemingly meets this criteria too. Vince clearly meets the first 3 criterion, but PTSD is not just traumatic thing happened and you avoid reminders. It's also about how it affects your daily life. Those affecting daily life symptoms are changes in moods and thought patterns as seen in criterion D, and effects in reactivity and arousal as seen in criterion E. In both of these cases, the symptoms have to have started or been made worse by the trauma. We don't see Vince before Riley's death, and it seems like Walter's abuse was always just a part of Vince's life, so I'm going to go ahead and throw that part out. Instead, I'm just going to look at, does Vince have 2 features from both criterion D and criterion E? In a slightly uncharacteristic of me fashion, I'm going to start with criterion E and then circle back around to criterion D. Criterion E is interesting because it does seem like people know at least a little bit about these. This is where you get things like exaggerated startle response and problems with concentration, but neither of those apply to Vince. There are 6 possible features and only 2 are needed, so I'm going to look at 2 features that I think describe Vince very well: reckless behaviors and angry outbursts. One of my favorite things about Fire Country is how it draws a clean line between reasonable firefighting call and recklessness that puts lives on the line. Just look at the pilot. While Bodhi is technically escaping Three Rock, he makes a clear argument to Manny that Eve and Jake are in danger and he is going to save them. But then look at the season 3 finale. He is injured and takes a man who is in a nursing home because of dementia-related wandering into a burning building without a clear way to get out. Heroics on Fire Country do not require recklessness. On the contrary, recklessness gets people killed. Vince is very clearly aware of this. In My Kinda Leader, Vince tells Eve he needs a firefighter, not a fallen hero, when she risks her life to save an inmate who was burned in a fire. In season 2, he does this twice. First, in Something's Coming, when he tells Jake that putting out an RV fire isn't worth firefighter lives, and later, in No Future, No Consequences, he threatens to kick Manny off a fire when Manny dives onto dynamite to keep the crew safe. But while Vince overall is very clear about the importance of safety, he doesn't always follow it, especially not when he's triggered. In the episodes wherein we do see Vince act recklessly, because he's triggered, we also see him do the opposite. We see his rational brain slowly slipping away until he is just completely impulsive because he's so triggered. Look at Get Some Be Safe. He goes into a barn on fire to rescue a kid and tries to get her horse to come out. But when the horse won't come out, he brings the kid out without it because it's not safe to be in the structure. He turns back around and realizes that Bodhi hasn't come with him. He starts yelling that they must prioritize the barn because it cannot be lost, and he's about to run back into the barn until Bodhi comes out, the horse following him. You see the same thing in the main story of Bad Guy. Vince spends most of the episode yelling at Manny that his plans are going to disrupt the balance of Sam's car and kill one or both of the kids. But by the end of the episode, Vince is only stopped from getting into Sam's car to push Sam out by Bodhi physically restraining Vince and talking him down. In the flashback to the night Riley died, we see him trying to run into the fire while in street clothes. This time it is Luke who is talking him out of it, but Instead of turning back, we see him collapse onto the ground crying and screaming. In Mama Bear, it's the same thing, but reversed. When a former inmate named Odin threatens Sharon, Vince tries to get into a fight with him, and Odin looks like he could break Vince in half. Thankfully, Luke is there to hold Vince back. Later in the episode, when Odin is threatening Three Rock, Vince tells Sharon that they need to stay put until Odin has been caught. So to me, the fact that Vince's recklessness isn't a universal trait, but something he does when he is extremely triggered by a threat, is the writers trying to show us that this isn't his personality, this is his illness. But Vince's anger works the same way. We hear over and over again from basically every character about Vince's anger. But just like the recklessness, the question isn't, is Vince angry? The question is, does Vince's anger show up or get worse when he is triggered, or is this just normal Vince? To me, I think it might be worthwhile to look at how Vince's family sees his actions before Riley's death and how Vince sees his own actions before Riley's death. I've already talked a lot about what Vince was like when Bodhi was growing up in Bodhi's video, so here's a short recap. Sharon refers to Vince's behavior as barking out orders like he was the boss when the kids were growing up. Bodhi says that Vince made him feel unworthy of being Cal Fire or a Leone. And to round out the trio of Vince's surviving non-Walter family members, Luke acknowledges that Vince giving Bodhi a hard time was just normal Vince behavior. But Vince doesn't seem to see himself that way. In the conversation where Sharon says Vince would bark out orders, Vince says that his parenting was about expecting Bodhi to have consequences while Sharon was coddling him. As for when Bodhi was a kid, it's easy to forget this, but Vince was a Little League and PTO parent. So much so that he jokes about debating who should have won one year's Little League championship with Wes Brooks. He puts up with Walter's abuse so that Bodhi and Riley could have a relationship with their grandfather. And maybe this sounds a bit like what Walter does in At the End of My Rope, presenting as non-abusive as part of a larger abuse strategy. But pay attention to the performativeness of Walter's actions. He is loud and vivacious when he chats with first Eve and Jake, and later with Arthur and other members of Station 42. But Vince, yeah, he certainly does praise Jake in front of Bodhi, but it doesn't fool Manny. Likewise, when we see him trying to get kids off a bus or teaching business owners how to put out a fire, it feels exactly like his normal personality, not a big show. So just like with the recklessness, it isn't Vince is an angry person, it's Vince seems to be unaware that his anger isn't read to the people around him as normal. With those two features proven by the text, Vince does seem to meet the criteria for Criterion E. But now we need to look at Criterion D, the ones that focus on changes in mood and thought patterns. Really though, instead of looking at all possible features of Criterion D, I want to narrow down on two, the cognitive distortion features. I know cognitive distortions is a big phrase with a complicated meaning. Maybe the best way to explain it is to think of cognitive distortions as similar to delusions. Both are false things that the person absolutely believes. But delusions, which are caused by psychosis, cannot be reasoned with. They come from a break with reality, and to get rid of the delusion, you have to treat the break. Cognitive distortions, on the other hand, come from trauma. They are still false beliefs, but there's something that the person can work through, and indeed that is a part of therapy for people with cognitive distortions. But Criterion D doesn't just consider cognitive distortions as one criteria. Instead, it breaks it out into two, one involving distortions around the causes or effects of trauma, and the second one around general beliefs about the world, themselves, or other people. In this analysis, I want to look at one of each. The first being Vince's cognitive distortions about how his bad parenting caused Riley's death, and the second being his distortion in season 1 that Bodhi is bad even in the presence of evidence directly to the contrary. If you've watched my Riley video, you might think that this is me retreading old ground, and I suppose in some ways it is, because I'm going to look at those scenes again. However, I think it's important to point out that the Riley essay really looks at Riley's death from Bodhi's perspective, which is fair because Bodhi is the main character. However, what I really want to do in Vince's essay is dig down into what Vince is actually saying in those scenes. In the attack scene, the second of Vince's 3 flashbacks, We hear him tell Sharon that it's his fault Riley died. He says that he missed a call from Riley, and he assumes that it's because Riley was trying to have him pick her up instead of Bodhi. When Bodhi comes in, Vince attacks him verbally, then physically. But at the end of the scene, when Luke is restraining Vince, he tells Vince that what happened was just an accident. It was nobody's fault. In Vince's next flashback, implied to be somewhere between a few minutes and an hour later, Vince is telling Luke that he hates Bodhi, himself, and Luke. But if you listen closely, he isn't really saying that he hates Bodhi at all. Instead, he says, I hate him. I hate my own kid. What does that make me? I hate myself for letting it get this far, and I hate you. You're his worst influence. When you think about those words, they aren't about Bodhi at all. What he's saying is that emotionally, in this moment of shock, he hates Bodhi. But actually, he hates himself for hating Bodhi, and importantly, because he's still blaming himself for Riley's death. Combine this with the comments in the previous scene, what Vince is really saying is Riley is dead because I'm a bad father, which is exactly what a distortion around a cause of trauma looks like. So that's the first type of cognitive distortion. Now it's time to look at the second, the negative distortions about oneself, others, or the world. If we think about what a cognitive distortion is, a strong belief that the person absolutely believes that is absolutely not true, Vince's belief that Bodhi is bad or toxic lines up with this very well. I want to specifically look at what Vince says in Fresh Prince of Edgewater to show you how the show challenges Vince's belief that Bodhi is the bad guy right to his face, and somehow he doesn't see that. I already went over these behaviors in Bodhi's essay, but I want to go through them again to show you that what Vince believes just is not rational. Outside the hospital, Vince tells Sharon that Bodhi has already gone rogue on his first fire, proof that he shouldn't be at a fire camp. Sharon bites back that going rogue saved Jake, and Bodhi hints to Sharon that Vince drove him away. When Vince talks to Jake and Eve, probably about 10 minutes later, he encourages them to be completely truthful in their reports so Manny can see how dangerous Bodhi is. Later in the day, Vince yells at Bodhi for being in the way at a fire when he is actively trying to put out a fire on Manny's orders. Vince orders Jake to do some heroic stuff, Jake does it, and then Vince praises him for it right in front of Bodhi and Manny. A few minutes later, when Vince tells Manny he did a great job keeping the fire under control, Manny reminds Vince that it was the inmates that did a great job, especially Bodhi. But Vince says that Manny got good Bodhi. Good Bodhi is just a setup when what I presume Vince sees as real Bodhi comes out and makes a mistake, which means that his heart gets broken. But you know, that cycle of kid does something good, kid does something bad, kid does something good again, is just how parenting works. It's how being human works, but to Vince, clearly it isn't. To him, it's proof that Bodhi is actually bad. Bodhi saving Jake from certain death doesn't make him good. Bodhi fighting a structure fire with a glorified garden hose doesn't make him good. However, punching Jake, apparently that makes him bad. If Sharon doesn't see it, Sharon is in denial. On the surface, this looks similar to what Walter does with manipulating how people see Vince. But moving past the intent, look at how these two men act when they are doing the same function, shaping how people see their son. Walter has his big personality and makes himself out to be the victim. They all believe him, or at least they don't see what he's doing. But with Vince, everyone to whom Vince tries to convince Bodhi is a bad person is completely aware of what he is doing. There is no hiding it. There is no, maybe Vince is right, Bodhi is terrible. There is only, should we go along with what Vince wants, or should we lie? So when you take these two examples together, one about the cause of Riley's death, and one about Bodhi's supposed badness, Vince is demonstrating beliefs that are not consistent with facts and nothing. Not Luke saying that Riley's death was an accident, not Sharon saying it's ridiculous to have Bodhi sent away for saving Jake's life, or Bodhi fighting a fire competently is enough to show Vince that he's wrong. These are not just things that Vince believes, they are cognitive distortions. So this shows that he meets criterion D, and combined with the fact that he meets the other 4 criterion we've talked about, we're starting to see the fuller picture that Vince might have a mental illness. But we've still got 3 more criterion to go over, and I call them the yes, this is mental illness criterion. This is because if you look at basically any mental health diagnosis, you will see some version of these 3 criteria. time, severity, and lack of another cause. In the case of PTSD, the symptoms must have lasted for a month. If it hasn't been that long, then their symptoms might instead fall into what's called acute stress disorder. There's no question that Vince meets this. Yes, I am specifically pulling examples from early season 1, but I could just as easily go through seasons 2 and 3 to pull out examples. The second criterion in this set is severity. It has to have an impact on the person in an area of functioning, and there is no question that it has a major impact on Vince's parenting. Almost every time I touch on a symptom of PTSD that involves Bodhi, Bodhi experiences that symptom as abuse. But if you take one thing from this video, it's the duality that Vince wants to have a relationship with Bodhi, but he also projects so many of his distortions onto Bodhi and Bodhi's actions. He literally tells Jake that the reason Bodhi punched Jake is because Bodhi wishes he got to ride around in a fire truck all day with Vince like Jake does, and there is zero evidence to support this. There is negative evidence to support this. Bodhi actively wants to be sent away so that he doesn't have to see his dad at all, but Vince's behavior toward Bodhi has made it to the point that the only thing Bodhi sees in those first few episodes is Dad hates me and I hate him. The final criterion is the one about other causes. As far as we know, Vince does not have a medical condition that would cause his symptoms, but what about his drinking? Because Vince drinks a lot. Well, none of the examples that I have given have been when Vince is drinking. The only time I can think of when he might display a symptom of PTSD is when Vince gets into a fist fight with Liam, but I feel like most guys, upon having learned that their wife seemingly had an affair while she was gone for 3 months, and now that affair partner is showing up to say to your face that you were a bad husband, react in an entirely dissimilar way when they are drunk. Also, Liam provoked and participated in that fight. Now, after this very long essay, you are probably wondering what the point is. Why is it important to show that Vince has PTSD? So important that I split this essay on PTSD away from his larger essay about how he tries to redeem himself as a father in season 1. And I think the answer to that is that a big part of Vince redeeming himself as a father is him trying to prove that he isn't Walter. Vince may have done a lot of emotional harm to Bodhi, just like how Walter did a lot of emotional harm to Vince and Luke, but that doesn't make Vince like Walter. I mean, compare this essay to my essay on Walter. Walter's actions don't happen when he's angry. He isn't trying to convince the people around him to see Vince the same way he sees Vince. He knows what he's doing. He is being subtle in ways that grant him legitimacy, smuggling how he wants the people around him to see Vince without directly saying Vince sucks to anyone's face. Vince doesn't need to redeem himself for turning into his father. He needs to redeem himself for refusing to get treatment and then hurting the people around him. Vince had resources. We know from Vince's discussion with Eve that CAL FIRE has an employee assistance program that he could have gotten counseling resources through, but he doesn't use any of them because he acts like the harm is in the past, not something that's still hurting his family. I would be missing something if I only talked about how Walter's abuse affected Vince, because Vince wasn't the only one growing up in that household. Luke did as well. I know that right now Luke seems to be living with and caring for Walter full time when he could have just as easily gone back to Japan. But like I said in Walter's essay, Luke is a victim in all this too. I mean, look at how Walter has just totally convinced Luke that Sharon is being hysterical about Walter's role in Vince's death. Luke taking care of Walter instead of dumping him like a nursing home like he should be is both incredibly frustrating and exactly in character for him. And I'm going to talk about why that is in my next video.